Testament that are mentioned. I've got them listed down there for you. But one called only two of them were even possibilities for being the author of the book of James. And the one that we know was the author is called James the Just. He was a half-brother of Jesus. If you look at Matthew 13:55, Jesus' half-brothers are listed there. They had the same mother, but different fathers. In Africa, that's a big deal because frequently women would come out of families where there was polygamy. So they often had different. They would have different mothers, but the same father. And sometimes I had African friends that would introduce me to other Africans that we didn't know, and they'd say, "Well, this is my brother, Mike. You see, we have the same father, different mothers. We both had the same heavenly father, but we had different earthly mothers. That's why I was white and they were black. Anyway, never mind. So the church, as always, from the very beginning, was clear and understood that James the Just, the brother of Jesus, was the actual author of the book of James. Some liberal scholars have tried to debate that, and as they debate all the authorship of all the books at some point or another, just about. And but James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. You can read that in Acts, you know that. And just virtually unanimously has been regarded as the author of this epistle in church history. He was an apostle. We're going to come back some of that when we get to James 1:1. You also would be interested to note that James is the first book of the New Testament, very likely the very first book written. James was martyred in approximately 62 AD. According to the historian Josephus. I don't know if you know who Josephus is, but he was a Jewish man that had been a general in the Jewish army when they revolted against the Romans, and he became a traitor and went over to the Romans. Later, he wrote a major history of the Jewish people from which we get an awful lot of our information about the New Testament era. And he tells us when James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred in approximately AD 62. You remember also from the book of Acts, where we haven't gotten to that in our Wednesday night Bible study yet, but Pastor's going to get there in a year or two. He's a little slow, as you know, when it comes to these things. How many years is it going to take to do Matthew, do you think, Pastor? Maybe 3. That's a long book. We've had some good studies in John and Daniel and Genesis, and I was doing Romans when I first came to the church. I've been doing that for quite a while, I understand. All right, but in Acts 15, there's a council of the church, so to speak, that was called to deal with the issue of whether or not Gentile converts had to be circumcised in order to be saved. That occurred approximately 49 AD. James doesn't mention anything about that in this book. That is sort of kind of a negative evidence that James was written sometime before that, because it seems it would have been impossible for him to have written a book of practical wisdom like this book is. Like Proverbs, it's a book of practical living out wisdom for day-to-day living. He didn't mention that council at all. It just seems impossible that he would not have at some point made some kind of reference, even a veiled reference to it, but there isn't anything like that. So almost all conservative scholars think that the book of James was written sometime in the mid to late 40s. So, 44 to 46, 47, somewhere in that time frame. There is no exact date for it, but it was written prior to the Jerusalem Council, prior to any of the epistles of Paul. And so it's the earliest book of the New Testament. The first book of the New Testament that was written. So that's a very significant fact. Now, what is James about? James is concerned for how we live out the Christian life in I've used the word decadent here, and fallen world, in a world that is in opposition to God, that stands in opposition to God. How we know that we have true faith and living out the true faith in the midst of this kind of world that we live in. That was a problem then. It's a problem now. It's been a problem for all Christians through all the ages of the Christian church. So it's a book that will help us to know how to live daily life in ways that will be pleasing to God and some of the major issues that come up in our daily living.
Dr. Joel Gregory calls it the gospel wrapped in shoe leather.
Yeah, okay.
And that is one of the most brilliant analogies. This is how you walk.
Did you all hear that? The gospel wrapped in shoe leather. This is how we walk. This is telling us how we walk, how we live out the gospel, how we live out our relationship to Christ in the world. James is helping us to do that. You may notice that the very first issue that James with, it has to do with trials. Has anybody in here ever had a trial? Or a difficulty, or a trouble, or an affliction, or a tribulation? You can use all those different words, but James is going to deal with that. How do you live out life in the midst of that? You remember that around the time that the book of James was written, and certainly while James was the head of the Jerusalem church, the church was undergoing persecution. Many of the Christians had to abandon Jerusalem, leave Jerusalem, and they went to all kinds of different places, which actually turned out to be a blessing in God's providence. We've been talking about some of that in the conversion of Paul, and as he was going to Damascus because of the Christians there, he was going to persecute. We talked last week in our Wednesday night Bible study about Antioch, and there was a seemingly pretty good group of Christians there, maybe in Tarsus where Paul had went. Anyway, the Christians fled Jerusalem and began to preach Christ in lots of different places, and probably more than we even know. A lot of small towns and villages and places that we're not even aware of that are just not even mentioned in the history books. But that's why they left. And James was the head of the church at that time. Now I'm going to come back and talk about some specifics about James in a few minutes. But I've given you a list there of the important references, or the most important references, I hope, that refer to James, the brother of Jesus there. You can look at those. And then a short list of the three other men that were named James. Okay? We'll come back to some of those references that are listed there in a few minutes as we start with James 1:1. If you look at the outline that I've given you, the reason that I like this outline is because it recognizes that there is a structure to James. I don't know how many of you have done much outlining in your life. Most people haven't done a great deal. But one of the things you have to do when you're going to teach a book or a section of a book, or even a passage like the Sermon on the Mount, a part of Matthew or Romans 8, or any section that you take, or a whole book, in fact, you really want to try to make an outline of it and see what the structure is. That's what outlines are for, to help you see the structure of the book. And the thing that I liked about this outline that's taken from one of the modern commentaries is that he deals with these three themes. The trials, wisdom, and then the relationship of the haves and the have-nots, pretty much, in the church. And we will take note that all three of those issues, the trials, the wisdom, the riches and poverty situation, those are all very current problems. And the specific aspects of them are also current problems as we live out the Christian life. So he has organized the entire book around those themes. Now, sometimes you look at this and you say, well, this might be a little artificial. All outlines depend on the person that's doing them and what they see, how they see the book developing. I mentioned John MacArthur, who I was looking at his commentary on James this morning, and very good commentary, at least on the first section of it. I didn't just started it, just got it. And he's got a nice outline, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 10 or 12 major points. And he takes a section and just gives each. His theme is that the book of James is about the testing of faith to see if we have genuine Christian faith. And that, of course, is a true theme of the book of James. So if you see other outlines that you like, you've got a study Bible there in front of you that's got a nice outline of James, don't just tear it out and throw it away because you're going to like this one. All of them have their advantages and their pluses and maybe their minuses too. I like this one because of the structure. I think it gives the book of James a little bit more structure for us to see. So we'll be looking at the book of James following that outline pretty much. All right? Do you have any questions or anything you'd like to say about James? We're going to talk about James again a little bit more detail now. I'm going to say we do verse 1, but I don't know if we'll get it done or not. You remember when we were doing Psalm 23, I spent the whole first lesson on the Lord is my shepherd. The whole lesson just on those words. Well, here we can get the whole lesson on the first verse because there's a lot of important stuff in it. Any questions or comments that you'd like to make about James and your experience with James? Yes, Charles?
If you go to James 2:2, it says, or if they're come unto your assembly, and it's not the word church, that's the word synagogue.
That's right.
Scattered throughout Jerusalem.
Yes, that's right.
And so that is another point why it's an earlier written book, because he doesn't use the word church, he uses the word synagogue. So in Greek it is synagogue.
Yes, yes. I don't know if you were here when we talked about, we gave a little bit of a talk on synagogue and we were talking about church membership, and that was one of the points that I made, that several places in the New Testament, Peter does it as well, uses the word synagogue. Synagogue simply meant an assembly of people, and the word church came to be used almost exclusively later on. But in the early days, as you all know, the earliest Christians were Jews who were still continuing to meet in the synagogues. Paul, Peter, as you look through the book of Acts, they went to the synagogues, especially Paul on his missionary journeys in all of these cities that he visited throughout the Roman Empire. He started in the synagogue, even though his mission, his overall mission, was to take the gospel to the Gentiles. But he began in the synagogues. Why? Because the synagogues were where people understood what the Old Testament was about. They understood about God. And there were God-fearers in those synagogues. Gentiles that had become enamored of the Jewish faith and have become, if not fully Jewish by going through all the rites of circumcision and so on, but who had become believers in Yahweh, believers in God, as a result of contacts with Jewish people somewhere, and they attended the synagogues, sort of like members, but not, maybe members or not, in our sense of membership. So yes, I appreciate you pointing that out, because yes, we would have said something, we will say something about that when we get there, but yes, the word synagogue, and that does point probably to an earlier time in the near the beginnings of the Christian church, as the church was beginning to struggle with how do you live out all that Jesus said and did in day-to-day life. We're used to struggling with a lot of the doctrinal issues. Paul was, as in most of his ministry, was struggling with huge doctrinal issues. And those are important because the doctrine leads to how you should live out your life. What you believe impacts totally how you live, what you do. James is not ignoring doctrine. He's assuming that his people know a great deal about the Old Testament, a great deal about Christ. That doesn't have to be explained explicitly. Now, one of the great things about the book of James that you will notice as we go through, it makes references, sometimes very direct, sometimes a little more indirect, to the Sermon on the Mount that our pastor's in the middle of. Well, you're more not in the middle anymore, but maybe toward the end of it, I guess. Well, we haven't got to chapter 7 yet, have we? So. Anyway, James does make references directly or indirectly, a good number of them, to the Sermon on the Mount. James was familiar with the teaching of Jesus. James was deeply familiar with the Old Testament. And we will see all of that as we go through step by step. Okay? So, it's a book of practical wisdom. It is, if you were going to pick out another book that James is like in the Old Testament, can you guess what book that would be? What's the book that really is the book of practical, everyday, living wisdom in the Old Testament? Ecclesiastes, some. Those get pretty theological. How about Proverbs? Yeah, you see those sections of Proverbs where there's a lot of similarity between what James does, the little short sections that have to do with wisdom. In fact, the word wisdom is a major deal in the book of Proverbs, and it's a major deal in the book of James. Why wisdom? What is wisdom? Is it just being smart and being a mathematician or a scientist or a great entrepreneur in business doing AI or something? Is that wisdom? What's wisdom in the Bible?
It's the practical outpouring of your understanding and knowledge.
Okay. It's the practical outworking of understanding of who you are in relationship to God.
It's applying the knowledge.
It's applied knowledge, yes. It isn't just theory. It is knowledge that how do we live in light of these great truths about Jesus? How do we live wearing the shoe leather that we walk in day by day? Not walking on the clouds and thinking of something up there all the time, but how do we live in terms of relating to God? Wisdom is living out a life that is pleasing to God. It is not just intellectual ability as we often use the term. Charles, again?
Many students go to college, but then when they get out of college, they don't know how to practically use the knowledge that they have. So like, if you take a electrician, he has to learn how to be an electrician, then he gets to be a journeyman, then he gets to be an electrician. In other words, he doesn't just, the day he starts, he doesn't just get to be an electrician the day he begins. He has to earn that position by application of his skill, and that's what a lot of our young people come out, go through college, but when it comes to wisdom, they have no wisdom to carry out, to use that knowledge. I knew a kid that went all through college and ended up bagging groceries at Bond's. He didn't know how to use that knowledge that he had gained. And so not only do we have the wisdom is being able to have understanding and knowledge to act out that wisdom that you've already attained.
But isn't it the emphasis on those that have the understanding and the wisdom and the knowledge to impart that to those that come out of college, to those that are, new Christians, to those, all that. It's not, we don't keep it to ourselves.
Mhm. What we used to say, I spent most of my career training pastors. And we had students that they would graduate, they would go through, they would get the grades, they would graduate. And yet we would say of them sometimes, a few, not many hopefully, but they went through seminary, but seminary didn't go through them. In other words, they were the same person when they got done as they were when they began. Why? Because they didn't absorb the truths that they were using and then begin to apply those truths to their lives and to their ministries. They had a way of preaching that they preached when they went in, and when they got done, they preached the same way. You couldn't tell there was any difference in content, any difference in ability, any deepening knowledge that they may have had of their relationship with God, and in theological as well as practical terms. One of the problems with going to seminary and learning to be a pastor is that the seminary can't teach you a great deal of what you need to know to actually pastor a church on the ground. Right? Every pastor knows that. Your first big learning experience isn't seminary, it's what happens when you're out of seminary and you're called to pastor a church, and that's when you start learning a lot of the practical things, applying what you have learned, and hopefully pastors in that situation will find a church that understands that and will help them to grow, where you've got wise elders and deacons and people like that, Sunday school teachers that help them to grow and to mature. Because just going to school doesn't mean you're wise. I've known a lot of people with PhDs that were plain idiots. Excuse my expression.
We say never give a screwdriver to an engineer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true in all fields, but I'm more familiar with the discipline of the church and seminaries and so on than anything else. All right.
The best seminaries are those who actually encourage their students, maybe small churches, but pastor a church and be getting the practical aspect of it as you were learning it. I did that.
Yes.
Extended my seminary degree into 5 years instead of 3, but the practical application of doing church while learning how to do it.
Yeah, schools that have the church at heart require that. They require practical experience. They require you to actually be in ministry while you're in school. Because the seminaries aren't made for academics. They're made for the church. They're built for the church. They're supposed to be training for the church. And one of the things that I felt that I tried to do during my entire ministry was I've always been enamored of the academic side of things. But I tried as I taught to always make the academic part of what we were learning, using Greek or Hebrew or New Testament theology, all of those things, using them in a way that would help those students and teaching them in a way that would help those students to grow in their practical ability to minister to the people of God in the churches. And I knew a lot of teachers that did that. And sometimes you get some that are, I hate to say it, but when I went to Southern Seminary for my first theological degree, my Master of Divinity degree, that school at that time seemed to be almost totally concerned with screening out students that were going to go through their graduate programs. They were going to get a PhD or a THM or some other graduate degree, rather than training people for ministry in the churches. Now, they would deny that if you ask them, but the practicalities of how they work the classes. And for example, took a course in the book of Hebrews. And the teacher was an excellent teacher. But because of the academic aspects to it, he spent almost half of the semester introducing the book of Hebrews. And we got to about chapter 4 in expositing the book of Hebrews. Virtually every student in that class would have said, let us read the introduction. You test us on it, we'll read it, and you spend the class time expositing the book of Hebrews so we can use it as we preach and teach. All right. James is a book that is practical, living, and we're going to see that. Now, we've got a few minutes. Let's talk about James.
Before you're on that line, and it applies directly to James, some of the best wisdom I received was when a professor said, if someone in your congregation is hurting, they don't care if a word in the New Testament is an aorist participle. All they want to know is, how can God help me and get me through my hurt?
Yes.
And you look at James, and this is all about the practical application. It's, are you going through trials? Yes. Let me tell you why. And let's.
Yeah, and that illustrates the point that I was
Yeah.
trying to make. I've always had an interest in the academic side of things and the theology and the biblical languages and so on. But if you can't use that and make that a living thing in the life of the people of God and apply it, and you don't have to use it all the time to apply it. You know, that aorist participle may be important for interpreting a verse when you're expositing the scriptures. But it's not going to help anybody, like our friend said, when you get down to, I'm hurting today, my father just died or something, and you need some encouragement. Got a child that's sick, having trouble with my wife, whatever kinds of difficulties, got problems at my work, whatever. The practical things need to be there. And if theology and biblical studies and exposition are done right, in my opinion, they will meet and be directed toward the practical. That's what James is actually doing. He's assuming that you know a great deal, that his people know a great deal. That's why he can just cite passages in the Old Testament and assumes that they know what he's talking about, because he assumes that they understand. And he doesn't have to explain it. But, James is very practical. Let's talk about James a little bit. The very first word in the book, typical of New Testament letters, as we've seen in a number that we have studied over the years and so on, as you read New Testament letters, New Testament era letters, Romans, Greeks, they always begin, the person writing the letter identifies themselves. Now we start out, dear so-and-so, dear Bill. And at the end, love, Raina. Okay? Now, you don't have to write your letters, dear Bill and love Raina, but Bill and Raina would write letters like that. But they start out with identifying the writer. I want you to notice something about this one. James, a bondservant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. All right, this James could have said some other things about himself, a good number of things about himself. What could he have said to identify himself to the churches, to the church that he's writing to?
He could have declared himself to be the half-brother of Jesus, like Jude did.
Yeah, the brother of Jesus. Yeah, he could have said that. That's one. What else?
I was one of the 12.
Could have said he's one of the 12. Chosen by whom?
Jesus.
Jesus. Yeah.
His
Good.
brother.
Yeah. What else? He was the son of? Who's his mother? Mary. Yeah. Mary is my mother. Everybody in the early church would have known who Mary was. Why? Because she was the mother of Jesus. I mean, you go back to the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, and Mary is an important figure in those first chapters, and she figures all the way through, and she was there in the early church on the day in the book of Acts. All right, so he was son of Mary. He was one of the 12. He was brother of Jesus. What else?
Jewish leader? Was he a leader? Jewish leader.
Well, I could have said something like Paul did about being a Jewish leader, you said. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Leader of what? What was he the leader of?
The Jerusalem church.
The Jerusalem church, the mother church of all the churches. That was a huge position. Now, how we go from this James, who at one time, according to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, Mark 3:21, James and his brothers, and probably his sisters, maybe Mary too, thought Jesus had gone mad, lost his mind, gone insane. Go back and read Mark 3:21. They were about ready to lock him up. They just thought that what he was saying, what he was doing, he was nuts. And yet at some point, there's another point that I'm raising here. At some point, that all changed. And James, the brother of Jesus, moves from being an unbeliever, thinking his brother is insane and pretty much rejecting him, to becoming the leader of the Jerusalem church. We're not told how that happened, but it happened. How did James become a believer? Do you know? Is there any hint in the New Testament?
It's only supposition.
Hmm?
It's only supposition how he became a believer. But it's like Mary and Jesus' brothers were declared that they were with the 120 when Jesus actually came into the midst of them.
Yes.
So at some point after his death and resurrection, he became a believer.
Yes, but there is another, on that line of thinking, there is another place in the New Testament where James is mentioned in a very prominent way. How about 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7? Remember what that says?
Beautiful.
Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appeared to James. Whether or not that is precisely when he became a believer, I don't know, but it certainly was impactful in the life of Paul, and Paul's the one that's recounting that. So, he doesn't mention that Jesus appeared to me. Is there anything else you can think of? I think that we just about covered it. There's probably one or two other things we might be able to say, but they all just fit under these categories. So you see, James, Frank,
I understood he appeared to the women first.
he did. Jesus did when he was on resurrection morning. He did. But there were a whole lot of other appearances. Go back and read 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul just lists out. He appeared to 500 brethren at once. We don't know when that was exactly. And then he lists a bunch of people that Jesus appeared to. That those events are not recorded in the Gospels. But you have lots of resurrection appearances in the Gospels. But Paul says he appeared to James and then some of the other apostles. So, James is also counted among the apostles. He had seen the risen Lord. Now, I'm taking all this time to say this, and we'll come back to this. Our time is just about gone. He doesn't say any of those things. All of these credentials that he could have laid out. Why doesn't he? Probably two reasons. One, he didn't need to. Everybody knew who he was. But more importantly, the important thing that he was that he was a slave, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, of God and of Jesus Christ. That was his real credential. It shows a kind of humility that is amazing, really. Now, there are times that you have to recount who you are. Paul had to do that on a couple of occasions, and he's not being proud doing that. Yes?
Well, one time when I studied this, part of what was told in the lessons was that if he had mentioned himself as anything other than bondservant or anyone else, it would magnify them. It would cause them to have them in a higher state than what he was trying to say as far as who Jesus was. But I don't know if that's...
There could be some truth to that. The apostles don't want to magnify themselves or others. They want to magnify Christ. And that may be part of the explanation. But James doesn't mention any of the things, any of his heritage, any of his qualifications, any of the great things that he had done. He doesn't mention it. He simply says, I am a servant, a slave of God and of Jesus Christ. We'll come back to that next week. Okay? All right. That was the bell, in case you all didn't recognize that. God bless all of you for being here, and happy to have you here.
Thank you. You don't like it?
I know. I'd break it.
It's as big as this country. It is. Same size. I live I have a house up way on the west coast of Australia.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Okay.
About 800 miles from here.
Okay.
Right. I would go from the first. She's looking forward to this study.
It's always.
And then they just did a tour of Phillips. Get a plan. Okay, my house is so happy.
Brisbane's on the east coast. We're close to the west coast.
House disappeared.
I didn't realize it was so bright in the house. And then I let Megan have to do it. And I told her how all you tucked in.
And that's it, I've never gone.
I'm self-taught. I did do a year with the Womack Ministries correspondence. But yeah, I'm not a theological community. I know no Greek, I know no Hebrew. I do have access to lexicon and stuff, but
It's just,
I wish they had existed when I was studying.
yeah. Oh, yeah, see, you put it all on this.
time frame where it's
I still like Greek stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I know all the things. I'm running over. I'm always asking Bill, just a little, can you do this? Oh, good. Raina, nice thing, please.
As long as I know I can get it on the water.
Hello, I don't hear you.